Good morning or good afternoon and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Ross Shuster. Ross is the CEO of Howden. Howden is an air and gas handling technologies company specializing across multiple verticals of over 5,000 employees and a very, very long history, 167 years history. So welcome, Ross. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I've seen some of the other interviews you've done, and I've found them very, very insightful. So it's definitely a pleasure to be speaking with you.
So you obviously have a long career across multiple sectors, to leading global brands in Johnson Controls and United Technologies Corporation, and obviously a huge broad experience across that in multiple sort of technologies and certainly multiple regions and specifically China. You spent a lot of time there and in Asia, and seeing those fast growing markets. So coming into, I guess, Howden and I guess being bestowed with quite serious responsibilities to look after a company that has been around for 167 years. And I guess there aren't many companies in the world that have successfully managed a series of transitions across that span of time, specifically in the industrial sector. So I guess you're looking to span the next sort of transition, energy transition, and I've noticed that since you've come into your role, a whole swathe of announcements across hydrogen. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you've come out now into Howden and how you're looking at hydrogen, and maybe talk a little bit about how your experience and views are helping you formulate, I guess, the strategy for going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, I spent a number of years with Johnson Controls and United Technologies. Last 20 years of which have been outside the United States, even though I'm American. So I spent some time in Singapore, quite a while in China, and then the UK, and now to Glasgow, where Howden is headquartered. And a variety of roles in that company. A lot of times relative to the energy, it was really more on the energy demand or the energy conservation side of the energy industry. And then joined Howden in late 2019, in September 2019, as a CEO. And I tell you, it's an amazing company. It's as you mentioned, it's got 160 years of history. It's a company that's in air and gas handling in different forms and fashions since its start, 160 plus years ago. Originally, doing fans to make steamships, more efficient, and so kind of that air handling, that efficiency is in our roots. But it's really evolved. Today we have nearly 6,000 employees across 34 countries, 90 locations, and a very broad offering of fans, compressors, and turbines. In mining, where we're a leader in ventilation and cooling, wastewater, where we're leading in wastewater treatment, oil and gas, tunnels, metro, etc. But what's really exciting for us, and as you mentioned, is the hydrogen segment. And it's not a segment that is new to us. In fact, we've been involved in compression of hydrogen for 100 years. In fact, a gentleman by the name of William Burton, who was one of the founders of a company called Burton Corblin, is one of Howden's companies, and that was an individual that invented the diaphragm compressor, which in essence is still used today and is still one of the main ways to compress hydrogen. So we just see it as hydrogen, and the environmental hydrogen is part of what we do. It's a long history. We bring a lot of experience to it. And we're really pleased to be in a spot where we can take our experience in environmental hydrogen and hydrogen in general, and now start to apply it to environmental hydrogen, which is obviously a very fast growth segment for us.
Excellent. And in terms of segments, we're seeing hydrogen across the broad spectrum of value chain, so from transport and heat, potentially also as storage for power generation. And I've noticed equally a whole spread of different projects that you're involved in, from I guess e-fuels to hydrogen refueling stations, to working with electrolyzer leaders like Nel. And can you just tell us a little bit about how you see hydrogen sort of fitting in, and equally, I guess is that an advantage, because you can operate in everywhere that hydrogen could be applied. in terms of thinking about clean hydrogen replacing methane specifically?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an advantage for us. I think it's actually a very interesting spot to be in, because as you mentioned, the technologies and the expertise we have, hydrogen compression, applies very broadly across end uses. So we see obviously in industrial uses with steel. So we've involved in hydrogen compression for green steel plants. Very much involved in hydrogen compression for mobility. But also shipping, as you mentioned, e-fuels as well. So it gives us a perspective of a lot of different industries and how they're developing with the use of environmental hydrogen. And I can mention a few things in terms of which ones are probably have a little bit earlier traction, although I think the traction across all of them eventually is going to be very strong. And then it's also unique for us because there's a lot of discussion around decentralized hydrogen generation or centralized hydrogen generation, whether it's transported in gas form through pipelines or on tube trailers or in liquid form. And the benefit we have is that we're involved and our technology applies to all those, whether it's large scale production, small scale production, production of gas, production of liquids. And so it's an interesting spot to be in. It also gives us the advantage to work with clients who are, and what we see is a lot of these projects are finding their way, trying to figure out what technology applies, how to design the best approach to get the best financial returns and returns out of the project. And so, example, we worked with one customer where it started off, and this was looking at mobility. Should we build decentralized generation? And we were there, and then the financials started to switch. So let's look at centralized generation. Let's look at gas versus liquid. And so it really puts in perspective where we get a broad view, but probably more importantly, it gives us a perspective because of the breadth of our offerings, where we can really work with clients to figure out what is the right thing and not have a bias based on what equipment we may have.
And I mean, in terms of the actual handling of hydrogen, it strikes me, just speaking now, that obviously there needs to be some considerable, the compressor market, or the need to compress hydrogen at various points of the value chain, depending on which verticals you're addressing, is actually quite considerable given the volumetric nature of hydrogen, and actually probably a huge potential compressor market for actually compressing that gas compared to, say, methane. Is that right? Is that how you see it? Something actually one of the big problems of hydrogen is to compress the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, when we talk to others in the industry, clients and other peer companies and different technologies, obviously the electrolyzer is an important part of it, right? So, the technology, the efficiency that goes into the electrolyzers, arguably probably the most important part of it, of the system, if you will. But right behind that is the compression, because obviously what comes off an electrolyzer isn't, effective to use unless it's compressed or turned into to a liquid form. And both the safety and reliability associated with that process is critical. That's where our experiences and experience of others is very important. But then also the energy and the cost associated with it, right? The energy to produce that, and then also the cost is a important consideration. And one of the challenges that I think the industry is all working towards is the gap between environmental hydrogen and other energy mediums is definitely closing. Very much because of the cost of renewable energies is coming down dramatically, solar in particular. But there's still a cost gap to be closed, and it's something that we're working on as well. And compression is a key part to the safety reliability, but it also has a role to play in the cost reduction aspect of it as well.
Yeah, certainly in terms of trying to eke out and scale the industry and using to create the least cost hydrogen and obviously the people are obviously looking at the electrolyzer process, but also the compression of that and the cost in terms of energy and the cost of the actual process. And I guess in terms of large scale versus decentralized, that you're open on both forms, because I guess it does depend on the end use. I mean, you see equal opportunities in both centralized and decentralized.
We do, and I think it'll be both. I think, you see mobility. I think it'll be a combination of large scale and more decentralized, smaller scale. You see, one area that we see, I believe, is probably going to be, probably earlier traction than some of the other areas is in industrial use. We've been involved with, the first green steel plant in the world using hydrogen, and they've got some intrinsic advantages in the industrial segment. One is your demand is determined, right? So you've got the plant, so you know what your demand is. It's very determinable. The other issue is you're producing hydrogen near the source of it being used. So the challenges, which I'm sure will be solved, and I know will be solved, around how do you get hydrogen from point A to point B through trailers or through existing pipelines or new pipeline infrastructure. That's not an issue. And so you start to see some of these industrial applications, I think, at least we're seeing them start to get very early traction, because they don't have, some of those concerns to worry about where the demand is going to be and predicting it, nor do they have to worry about transport. And then they've got the advantage of skills, all being able to be located at a plant level and not having to deal with that challenge. Now, I think the rest of the applications definitely get seeing traction in that as well, with mobility and others. But I think industrial will probably be, I think we'll see, and we are seeing some of the early acceleration in that.
And in terms of that specific project, the hybrid project, is it in Sweden, that do you have engineers working with their teams on the ground to try and understand and work out how to integrate the sort of compressor technology and the actual plant that's going to be producing fossil-free steel, excuse me. And at what stage are you seeing that? I mean, traditionally you would have, almost labs, and then you go to demos and have a sort of steady growth in terms of scaling up that technology, improving from I guess science through to the engineering piece. What's your take on the development cycle for some of these industrial processes?
Yeah, absolutely. To your question, we definitely are involved in that project and other projects very early stage. We're a company that has obviously product/technology, but they're typically not the kind of product, particularly in hydrogen, that you just spec off the shelf. You don't see a customer come and say, I need A, B, and C. What they're saying is, I need this to do A, B, and C. And then we come in with our engineers from an applications perspective to help the customer design what that process is going to look like, how we enable it through compression. And it really is one of our strengths. I mean, we have nearly 700 engineers of our 6,000 people. And at our heart, we really are an engineering company with technologies that we're able to use to enable that engineering. So in most of our applications broadly, outside of hydrogen, that we're involved with customers very early. I would say in hydrogen applications, whether it be steel, whether it be e-fuels, mobility, it's an absolute must, because, as I mentioned, customers are trying to figure out as they go, they're innovating as they go to what the best way to solve the challenges.
And I noticed the ownership structure of Howden is private equity, and does that give you some leeway in terms of not having to report to maybe such onerous quarterly cycles for sort of publicly limited companies, and you're able to maybe invest in a longer term technologies, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to speak positively or negatively about public versus private companies. What I would say is that with our ownership and our investor, KPS Capital Partners, they've been very focused, as we are, on the growth of the hydrogen segment. For similar reasons that we are as a company. First of all, one of our values is we do the right thing, and we see that contributing to society in a way such as decarbonization, which obviously hydrogen has a huge role to play in that, is simply the right thing to do. We're making investments now, and KPS recognizes it and supports it, that we'll get benefit in the short and medium term, but really this is a long-term growth trajectory. And we as Howden will play a part in that well past KPS's ownership period. And they recognize that, again, it's the right thing to do. And from their investor perspective, creating a revenue stream such as hydrogen that we play such an important role in, and it has a obvious long-term growth trajectory, is the right thing to do for their investors as well. So it's just one of those situations where what's right for the environment is right for the company, is right for investors, all aligned. And there's definitely a long-term perspective on it. You know, how are we going to really be in the right position for the long term of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly we're seeing right across the entire, you know, economy that anything that isn't aligned to I guess net zero is rapidly going to lose favor from any investor, you know, whatever their stripe, be it, you know, institutional investors or private equity or eventually, you know, public markets. So I think, yeah, that is becoming, you know, the only way, I guess, to do business now in terms of the changing climate. Is that something you've seen certainly in the last year, 2 years?
Yeah, we really have. I mean, it's not only around hydrogen, but just decarbonization and doing the right thing in general. You know, it's interesting because you see it. What's aligning now is both public, individual interests, government interests, and businesses, which obviously play into that. And you hate to say, you know, we point to the pandemic, and I think it, unfortunately, you know, it's a tragic thing, but I think that the pandemic will always be this mile marker in history, and we'll talk about it, things that happened pre-pandemic and things that happened post-pandemic. And so maybe we point to that too much, but I do think it felt like a time where the world just took a step back, people and individuals, and took a step back and reprioritized. And as we come out of the pandemic, one of the things that clearly has been reprioritized is the importance of decarbonization, both from people reprioritizing that, and I think very interestingly, countries across the board reprioritizing that, regardless of their developed economies or developing economies, which is not something that's always been the case.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Certainly, I've just come back from Greece and I'm talking to people on the ground. They've obviously had a pretty awful fire season there, and I was just shocked by the lack of solar, you know, just anywhere. And you know, yeah, they have solar thermal, but they're photovoltaics, and you know, and passing, you know, coal-fired or it was gas-fired power stations. Just looking at, you know, the resource mix they've got and what they can potentially do there, and certainly, yeah, they're gonna have to do it. The whole world's got to have to rapidly take this thing, and I think, yeah, the frailties of our economy and whole systems have been laid bare by the pandemic, and certainly the fear is that, you know, climate change could be a lot worse than that, and certainly it has clearly huge potential to do that.
I think it's interesting. It reminds me of, you know, like I said, I was in China or in Asia, China for 14 years, and again on really the demand side of energy and conservation. And I remember seeing a presentation that was it laid out what is somewhat intuitive, but you don't think about. And what it did is it laid out the focus of governments on environmental issues relative to GDP per capita. And you know, what it showed, and it's probably kind of intuitive, is below GDP per capita, below a certain level, it's not the focus of a country. They're more focused, as you would think, on the development of the country and economic growth for the people and society. And then at a relatively low level, not a surprisingly low level, there's a switch where the importance of environmental issues starts to come into play. And you've seen China over the last 20 years move from below that line to above that line. And you know what countries are doing, obviously, is they're trading off what has traditionally been seen as the headwind caused by environmental focus. So kind of it's seen as a headwind to economic development. I think what's changed now, specifically to environmental hydrogen, is that countries aren't seeing that environmental hydrogen is a headwind to development. They're actually seeing it as an opportunity to develop their economies. So you see, you know, what we're seeing is interest in environmental hydrogen, not only in Europe and more mature countries, developed countries like Japan and Korea, but Brazil, South Africa. Those countries are now seeing environmental hydrogen as actually a growth driver for their economies, which I think is one of the reasons why it's getting so much traction. It's, you know, it doesn't have to be anymore a headwind to developmental economic growth. It's actually a tailwind to economic growth.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that with some of the successive cycles, and having looked at, you know, wind initially, and then solar, and then the speed that the solar grew, but also the geographical spread of where it grew. It was no longer yet developed in the rich West, as it were. Yeah. Certainly that sort of growth phase, and if you look back and say the solar industry, there was obviously strong feed-in tariff support for that initial growth phase in sort of 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7. But as soon as the financial crisis hit in 2012, that shifted in the market. Luckily it was almost like a relay baton. Solar had grown enough to be taken on by Latin America, by some of the other developing markets that had rich irradiation and needed electricity quickly, which was a big bonus for solar. It can be deployed quickly, and that got it on its path. And then potentially now with hydrogen growing in the 2020s, I think we've been astounded by the sheer spread of people on our platform and consuming our content, because it is so global. Yes. We're seeing projects right across the board. I've lost track now of how many countries have actually got hydrogen projects going, but it's certainly up above the sort of 50s, 60s, and must be on for getting towards the 100 countries. It is going to grow, and I think that is also a symptom of the internet and the connectivity of a lot of markets now. As we see some of these future growth markets, they're going to be happening everywhere simultaneously. Everyone's sort of dialed in. You mentioned governments, and I wanted to sort of maybe take a step back. And we see the markets often with governments and policy being very important, finance and the actual doers, the people deploying capital, doing projects, etc. And that triumvirate, that those three power centers have to be well linked together. And the money's there, and we've spoken a lot. We've obviously just ran a finance investment event this week, virtually, and there's just a lot of capital there waiting to be deployed. Not a problem. We're seeing obviously companies like you taking investments, deploying engineers on the ground, getting involved in projects. So that last piece, policy, and just thinking about what has happened to date. We've been doing renewable energy events for over 20 years, or just under 20 years. There's been a lot of delay, a lot of vested interest, a lot of influence on the policy piece. Now, obviously, we're in the months before COP, which is happening obviously in where you're located in Glasgow. What are some of your thoughts around that? Are we seeing an opening up on the policy front, that there's suddenly a click, and the momentum and the lobbying and proper investment grade policy is being produced that is going to help connect people taking risks, deploying capital such as yourself with the financial markets? What are some of your thoughts around that sort of big picture and where we are with hydrogen?
I think it definitely has an important role to play, that it being government support. And we talked a bit about solar, and you talked very well about the curve that solar went on. I'm originally from California. Going back 30 years, California was one of the early areas to really government support for solar, and it needed it at the time, right? And they did it through regulations where so much of the grid had to come from solar produced energy or renewables. Some low-cost financing to make the hurdle thresholds for projects more attractive, and people would have said, well, if the industry can't stay on its own, why is it doing that? But clearly, it was an industry that needed that incubation to get going, and now we see where it is. And by the way, as we've talked, that's helping lower the cost of green hydrogen. So I think there's similar role that governments have to play in hydrogen as well. Today, and it's as we've talked about, a lot of countries are talking about how it plays into their future. China probably most notably with their recent 5-year plan, that it's a critical industry. So I think there's a lot of support growing. There's a lot of discussion. I think how that actually turns into policy is still in the discussion phases in most countries. But I think I'm confident it will start to emerge as we go forward. And to your point, it's different because there's a lot of financing available right now. The money is not the challenge. Maybe it's some incentives to make the hurdles a little bit more attractive. There's probably government work to be done in talking about in Europe, particularly pan-European infrastructure for pipelines, et cetera. But I guess to date, at least from our perspective, a lot of positive talk, a lot of positive discussions. Some discussions we're having with governments as well. but not quite turned into policy in general yet.
Yeah, well, it's going to be fascinating to see that, and I think, yeah, certainly from our perspective, we'll be looking to try and direct and try and communicate what is good quality investment grade policy, and highlight who is doing good support, and yeah, you mentioned China. We obviously have our China intelligence service, and it's beginning to get the messages begin to get out. Yeah, China is behind hydrogen, and I think certainly that will, I guess, narrow people's focus and make sure that they don't want to be left behind. They want to have good companies in your own domestic markets who have experience in hydrogen, and obviously no one knows where hydrogen will be in 20 years time, in 2050, and we've seen a range of analysts talking about from 10 to I think 30% of final energy demand, but yeah, I mean, whatever it'll be considerable growth from the existing 0.0 whatever percentage of clean hydrogen that currently exists. So yeah, it's going to be a fascinating ride. We're very pleased supporting our work, and we look forward to seeing Howden doing well across the whole spread of projects that you're working on, and obviously your team is going to be in Amsterdam for World Hydrogen Congress, and we're hopefully, as we return to normality, we'll be supporting the growth of the hydrogen industry across multiple markets as well. So we have our plans in place and are ready to go from our perspective. So we look forward to working with you and seeing your engineers and your teams on the ground, and listening to what will hopefully be a successful decade of case studies and growth and scaling up what is an important critical industry to help us on the path to decarbonisation. So yeah, thanks a lot for your support, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your hectic day to spend some time with us today.
Thank you very much. Very much enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, many thanks, Ross. Take care.
Take care.